Sir Walter Scott and the Waverley Novels. You have heard at times a strain of music far away. A band, perhaps, is playing the air of some martial song that you know well. The music comes nearer. You can almost imagine that you see the players marching down the street, and there they are, as stirring, as romantic, as beautiful as the distant music or the spirit, scenes, and happenings of the Waverley novels by Sir Walter Scott. Scott did not begin by writing novels. His first writing was poetical. He wrote stories in verse. If you do not already know these poetical stories, you probably will someday soon, because they are charming and delightful and so easy to read that one almost feels one must have read them before in dream. The novels are perhaps a little more difficult to follow, but not after we once get fairly started. They are wonderful books to read. Some of them are world novels. This means that in many countries and in many different languages, people may be found reading the Waverley novels. This statement is true of Dickens' novels also. Let us begin with Rob Roy, one of the Waverley novels, which is a great favorite with boys and girls. Francis Osbaldistone is sent by his father to visit his uncle Sir Hildebrand and the family seat Osbaldistone Hall in the north of England. Frank does not want to go into business and become his father's successor. The visit to Osbaldistone Hall is by way of punishment. His father means to choose one of Frank's six cousins to inherit his place in the business. Frank goes north, meets all the six cousins, his uncle Sir Hildebrand, Andrew Fairservice, a serving man who is as notable as character after his own way of life as Sam Weller, and above all, he meets a cousin of his cousins, Di Verman, beautiful, spirited, altogether charming and lovable. Owing to a business matter, Frank has to go further north from Osbaldistone Hall into Scotland. In the city of Glasgow, he is directed to Bailey Nicole Jarvie. He is given a mysterious warning in Glasgow Cathedral and goes up to the Highlands with Bailey Nicole Jarvie, seeking to recover a debt. Now we are fully set in the midst of the scenes of Sir Walter Scott's enchantment. The wild, romantic, beautiful scenery of Scotland, painted by a master's hand. The Highlanders themselves, proud, devoted, chivalrous, faithful, the cause of the royal stewards whose adherents them and sacrificed for them without stint, the glamour of old Scots songs, all these delights you will find in Rob Roy and in other of Waverley novels. The mysterious Mr. Campbell of the high road and the drove of cattle turns out to be Rob Roy MacGeorge himself. His wife, Helen, who is as fierce as she is heroic, is the central figure of one of the most dramatic actions of the story. Escape, danger, flight, battle, the allurement of a lost cause, striking characters for whom one forms a romantic attachment are all gathered within the pages of this novel. Ivanhoe is more robust and exciting. Read the opening scene between Garth and Wamba. This is mirror England of long ago, when Saxons and Normans were still hostile and separate, although living together in the heart of England. John had usurped the throne of King Richard, his brother, who had been fighting on crusade in the Holy Land. Here in the Greenwood, we meet Friar Tuck, the various knights. We visit Rotherwood and listen to Cedric, the Saxon master of Garth and Wamba. We see the beautiful Rowena. We meet the Jew Isaac of York and his lovely daughter Rebecca. There are great combats for knights to prove their knighthood at Ashby de la Chouch. There is thrilling siege of the castle Torquelstone. We discover who the Black Knight is, and best of all, we encounter in many disguises and lastly as himself Robin Hood. Read the account of the archery contest in chapter 13. Every word is thrilling. If we could go back through the centuries, we too would visit merry England, walk in the greenwood, and taste the venison pasty in Friar Tuck's cell. Watch while Locksley shot his arrows, and with Rebecca on the ramparts, follow the course of the great seas of Torquelstone. But thanks to the genius of Sir Walter Scott, we can see these happenings in imagination without leaving the 20th century, although the novel Ivanhoe was published more than 300 years ago. Sir Walter Scott was born August 15th, 1771, in a house belonging to his father at the head of the College Wynd in Edinburgh, Scotland. The family was well to do and happily situated. But when he was 18 months old, the little lad had a serious illness which left him a cripple. Every effort was made to cure his lameness. He was sent to live with his grandparents on the farm at Sandy Knowe, but while he gained strength, he was slow in learning to walk, and his left leg remained shrunken. He grew up tall and strong, unusually good looking and attractive. When he was a man, he thought nothing of walking 30 miles in a day. Apparently, his lameness had no influence upon his character except that it helped to make him considerate. He was always tender to those who had any bodily misfortune. Edinburgh is a beautiful city. Those who belong to it love their romantic town with devotion. But it was fortunate for Walter Scott and for us also that he spent some of his early years on a farm. What he saw and learned at that time influenced all his future life. A story is told that when he was 3 years old and unable to help himself because he was so lame, he was left alone in the open air at some distance from the farmhouse. A thunderstorm came up, and when they hastened to the little fellow, they found him lying on his back, clapping his hands at each flash of lightning and crying out, Boni, Boni. There was never anything lacking in Walter Scott's happy courage or in his tranquil enjoyment of the beauties he saw in nature or read about in books. His aunt used to read aloud to him. Like some other boys one has known, he played out by himself the battles described as he imagined they might have been fought. He was fascinated by old tales, old ballads, and history. From his early manhood, he had a passion for all kinds of antiquarian research. When he was a lad, he was sent to Edinburgh High School, a famous school, and here, after school hours and during recess, he became known to the other boys as a wonderful adept at relating stories. His audiences were closely attentive and delighted. He says of himself in a short fragment of autobiography that he was not a dunce, but an incorrigibly idle imp. Perhaps his chief pursuit was reading. Some of the books he read were Ocean, which is compact of Highland myth and story, Spenser, an exquisite English poet, many novelists and other poets, and the great collection of ballads known as Percy's Relics of Ancient Poetry. These are all manly books and stir the reader's blood and imagination like the sound of a trumpet. After Edinburgh School and Edinburgh University, where boys went at that time when they were very young, Scott became a lawyer. The study of Scott's law was to him an unending source of interest. But when he was a young lawyer without much to do, he was in the habit of telling stories to other young lawyers like himself who were waiting for clients. As the boys at school used to be fascinated, so the young lawyers later came under the same spell. We have by this time the origins of Scott's great work, the farm at Sandy Knowe, ballads, tales, and history, Scott's law, old customs, and characters, and the people whom he knew. He married in 1797 Miss Charpentier, the daughter of a refugee from the French Revolution. They lived in a cottage at Laswade, 6 miles from Edinburgh. Later, their home was at Ashtistill, also in the country, an old house on the south bank of the Tweed. He held during his life various law offices under the Crown, beginning as Sheriff Depute, then Sheriff, and later a clerk of the Court of Sessions. Although he wrote many books, he made a point of keeping other employment, so writing might be, as he said, not a bad crutch, but a good staff. But by 1805, it was plain that literature was to be his main occupation. Scott had a singularly affectionate nature, which in itself is almost sufficient to make a happy life. With his first fee as a lawyer, he bought a silver taper stand for his mother's desk. Scott was considerate of the feelings of everyone and he was greatly loved. He made much money by his writings, first by his romantic verse, which took the world by storm, and later by the long series of great novels which were published at first anonymously and only acknowledged by Scott as his own with reluctance years after he began publishing them. With his love for beautiful scenery, for Scotland, and for everything belonging to dignified and delightful ways of living, it was natural that Scott, from the result of his labors, should buy an estate and build on it a castle called Abbotsford. Here he lived with his family, dealing bountifully and kindly with many dependents and followers. He had tender care for all his neighbors, gentle and simple, as the old phrase runs. Scott valued what he had because it gave him the power to be good to other people. Sir Walter speaks to every man as if they were blood relations, was the description given of his manner by one of the men who worked on his estate. He was so popular and famous, it seemed all he had to do was to sit down and write a novel, and the world would ring with its fame. But Scott was at work generally before 6 o'clock in the morning. He was a man of remarkable industry as well as of unusual gifts. Yet, those who knew him noticed first and valued most his kindness and simplicity. He was a man of great reasonableness and common sense. He did not care to talk much about his writing, but rather of what he had done or seen. There was so little made of Scott's writing in his home, either by himself or anyone else, that his children did not know much about it. Someone asked Sophia, his eldest daughter, how she liked one of his books. Her answer was that she had not read it. Walter, The eldest boy came home from school one day, plainly showing signs of having been in a fight, and said that the other boys had called him a lassie. One of the boys had said something about the Lady of the Lake, and he was unaware that there was a book of that name written by his father. These incidents are related to show how simple and natural were Scott's ideas of himself and his work. During the last years of his life, Scott undertook the payment of a heavy debt. He had been partner in a publishing enterprise which was conducted with far too little reasonable caution in entering upon undertakings and expenditure. Although Scott was not an active partner and unfortunately had not informed himself about the firm's transactions, he was liable for the full amount of the debt. He refused to become a bankrupt and set himself the enormous task of paying every creditor in full. This last labor of his life is a heroic story. Friends, some of them unknown friends, offered him money. His sense of honor was so high that he would allow no mitigation of his task. He labored single handed and paid back large sums to his creditors. The final payments were arranged only after his death. He had cut down his way of living at Abbotsford. He allowed himself little rest and no luxury. Any boy who reads this story will learn from it something of the nature of business and of what is wise and right in business dealings. We discover at last the true reason why the characters in Scott's novels are great. It is because he is himself great and noble, with such a nobility that in all likelihood the world will keep him always as one of its heroes. His last words to his son in law, Lockhart, "My dear, be a good man," come into the minds of many people every now and then as they live their daily lives and bring them help and encouragement. We read Scott's novels because they tell thrilling and romantic stories, and we read them again for their nobility, high mindedness, dignity, and beauty. Thank you very much.